Welcome. Good morning and welcome. My name is David Friedman, and I am the Special Projects Editor of the Duke Journal of Constitutional Law and Public Policy here at Duke Law. Thank you all for joining us for the 2017 Spring Symposium on Voting Rights in Polarized America. We are very glad to have you. Before we get started, I would like to extend a few thank yous. First and foremost, I would like to thank our speakers who have traveled here today to help us have some of these conversations. We very literally would not be here without you, and we thank you for coming. We also want to thank our moderators, all professors at Duke who have graciously offered their time to lead the discussions and ask questions of our panelists. Christy Compost in the Journal's office for her support in planning and her help in preparing for today. The media office, the events department, our faculty advisor, Guy Charles, who has helped us to shape the symposium, who has helped us to shape the topic and to get us ready for today, and who has been a constant support for our journal. Last but not least, I would like to thank our entire journal staff for their support in making this event possible, and I would like to especially thank our editor-in-chief, Priya Kangura, whose support was invaluable in preparing for today. Today we have a number of faculty, students, and staff from across Duke. We have community leaders and activists in attendance. We have Duke Law families joining us, who are here from far away. We have been thrilled by the number of emails we've received expressing interest in this event. It has been the joy of organizing this event, and we are glad to be able to share it with you today. We chose voting rights as our topic this year, both because of its recent prominence in national news and because of its importance to our community. We wanted to capture the work that was being done by members of our community and in our own backyard. We wanted to talk about an issue that we felt was deeply important both to our country and to our own community. There might be no better person to start that conversation on the challenges of voting in North Carolina than someone who has lived it. Someone who began their career in public service after being denied the right to vote because of a so-called literacy test. Someone who not only went on to graduate from the University of North Carolina School of Law, but to become a congressman, a senator, and the first African-American Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. We are grateful to have him here today to speak, so please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, the Honorable Henry E. Frye.
Good morning, everybody. It's a beautiful North Carolina day, and I'm happy to be with you and to have my say. So please listen carefully to my few words for you, and I'll speak up and shut up, and you will know I'm through. That ought to get me a My role this morning will be to put a face to what has happened to many others attempting to register to vote in the state of North Carolina. Thank you for listening. August 25th, 1956 was an important day in my life. I had completed my 2 years overseas, as we said in those days, having served as an officer in the United States Air Force, in Japan and South Korea. My college sweetheart and I had agreed to get married on that day in Greensboro, North Carolina, some 75 miles from my home in Ellaby. I spent the night before at my parents' home in Ellaby and planned to drive to Greensboro for the afternoon wedding. Before leaving Ellaby, I would register so that I would be able to vote in the next election. So on Saturday morning, I proceeded to the registration office to register to vote. To my surprise, I was subjected to a series of questions about various presidents of the United States. When I inquired as to why I was being asked these questions, the registrar told me that they were, quote, right here in the book. I told him that I was prepared to read and write any section of the Constitution that he would like, but he said that if I did not answer the questions that he was asking, he would not allow me to register. I left the office, but then wondered whether he did not know that I was a resident of Ellaby. So I went back in and inquired if he knew. Oh, yes, I know your father and mother. And I read in the paper that you have been admitted to the UNC Law School. Well, why don't you allow me to register to vote? Because you didn't answer my questions. I couldn't believe what had just occurred. But the minister who was to officiate at my wedding tried to register the same morning, but he too did not pass what we call the literacy test. Fast forward with me now to 1968. I was elected to the North Carolina House of Representatives, representing Guilford County. When the General Assembly convened in 1969, guess what was my first bill? To abolish the literacy test as a requirement for voting in North Carolina. Without going into details, the bill was enacted by the House and the Senate, but it was defeated in the next general election. You may ask, why take up your time with this personal matter? Why? Well, first of all, if it happened to two educated persons, surely it must also have happened to many of those less educated, but who were less likely to do something about it. Secondly, it is important to emphasize an important fact. Laws are not self-executing. Laws are not self-executing. The legislative branch makes the laws, but the executive branch is responsible for seeing that the laws are faithfully executed. The people who make the laws need to know that those who deal with the public are following the laws not inconsistent with the Constitution. Let me say just a few words about the Voting Rights Act. It was, in my opinion, the most effective law in the history of the United States in ending racial discrimination. Congress made a mistake by not updating the formula on which Section 35 was based, especially after the United States Supreme Court's decision invalidating it as obsolete. Unfortunately, the North Carolina General Assembly immediately took advantage of the new U.S. Supreme Court's decision, Shelby County versus Holden, to place limits rather than expand the right to vote. It is my hope that the distinguished speakers who will speak today at this symposium will find ways for North Carolina to encourage rather than discourage people from registering and voting in this state of North Carolina. It is fundamental to a true democracy. And I might add, I know we don't have a pure democracy, we have a representative democracy. And really we have a Republican form of government. But I still say that it is fundamental to a true democracy, even a representative democracy. Thank you for listening.
At this time, we're going to move into our first panel discussion, Measuring Rights, Access, and Fraud in U.S. Elections. We would like to invite our moderator, Professor Robert Korstad, and our panelists, Professor Irving Joyner, and Ms. Isela Gutierrez.
Hey, it's nice to see all of you, and David, thank you so much and all your colleagues for organizing this symposium. I can't think of anything that we need to talk about that's more important in North Carolina and around the country these days, so I think it'll be a really insightful few hours that we have to spend together. I'm Bob Korstad from across the street at the Sanford School of Public Policy. Just a couple quick things, and they're lengthy biographies in the program, so we don't need to go into a lot of detail, but just a couple things about me. I've been involved in the Moral Monday movement, and Professor Joyner is, I've been sure, one of the many people who's helped get me out of jail and arranged for me to do some community service and stuff so that I can go free. It's been a really insightful process for me as someone who's from North Carolina, from Greensboro, actually, and has written a lot about social justice issues in North Carolina, particularly labor and civil rights issues. And I've been involved the last couple years with a colleague at UNC, Jim Laludis, who I worked with him in preparing some of the testimony for the NAACP's case against the voting rights, and we're in the process of hopefully writing some kind of a short book on that at some point. But it's really been quite illuminating to go back and look at the history of voting rights and in the state and the contest over those. The title of the tentative book that we have is called Fragile Democracy, and I think that's a really good way of looking at what we have. It's something we have to always be fighting for, and I think that no more importantly than today. Professor Joyner is one of North Carolina's most distinguished legal scholars and advocates. He has published widely on a variety of issues, as a award-winning teacher, but I think that his presence, both in the courtroom and in the General Assembly and on the streets of North Carolina, have been a real a guide for a lot of us in this state, and I hope for a lot of you budding lawyers too, to understand and appreciate the various things that you need to do as someone who has the skills and the experience that you have. And so I'm very much looking forward to his comments. Isela Gutierrez works for Democracy North Carolina, which is a really critical advocacy group that is very involved in both voter registration, but in protecting the right to vote. And again, one of the really critical and important organizations in the state. She's been involved in a whole variety of social justice issues around the country, and it's great to have her here on this panel. So I don't know what order we want to go in, but Isela, you want to start?
Sure.
Welcome.
Thank you. So I do research and policy work for Democracy North Carolina, and I want to start out by talking a little bit about voter access, ways to measure voter access, and then probably turn it over to Irv, and then maybe move into voter fraud as and ways to talk about and understand the allegations of voter fraud that we're hearing so much about. So first of all, there are three ways I'm going to talk about measuring voter access. First, the rules, then turnout, then self-reports from voters. So the rules restricting or opening up access to the franchise. As I'm sure all of you know, in 2013, and as Honorable Henry E. Frye mentioned in his remarks, the General Assembly passed one of the most restrictive voter suppression laws in the nation in 2013 following the Shelby case. So North Carolina, prior to the passage of that law, and again, following the decisions of the Fourth Circuit and after the great legal work of some of the lawyers in this room, had this amazing access for voters, this same-day registration during 17 days of early voting, out-of-precinct voting on Election Day, pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, public campaign finance systems for our judges and for Council of State races. So this really a Cadillac election system that really made access to democracy a reality in a way that it's not true across the nation, has not been true. So then that meant that what we call the monster law, H589, swept all that access back. And we saw in 2014 at Democracy North Carolina how, in the midterm election, how the rescinding of that access affected voters. Of course, a midterm election is not as high a turnout election as a presidential year, but in that year we saw 30,000 voters denied access to the polls. And we estimated that based on historical turnout or historical use of same-day registration and out-of-precinct voting. And then we also just heard a lot of stories from voters who were sent to multiple precincts, ended up in long lines, could not register. People who thought they had registered correctly through the DMV, for example, they moved from county to county. They thought that they had done everything correctly, but their registration wasn't there when they turned out to vote. If same-day registration had been in place for them, they would have been able to cast a ballot. So in the 2016 was the first year that we were supposed to have photo ID in place. And so the 2016, through legal wrangling, we had SDR, we had out of precinct for the 2016 primary, but it was the first election with photo ID. There had been 2 years of education around photo ID, and that launched in March. We saw some problems with the administration of photo ID, particularly the reasonable resemblance, the reasonable impediment element that was supposed to be a safety net for people without ID, poorly administered, so harming voters. But more, what we saw in 2016, the general, I think that we probably saw some confusion among voters. So the photo ID requirement was not in effect for the 2016 general. Same-day registration was in effect. Out-of-precinct voting was in effect. So in a lot of ways, the 2016 general was a return to the norm for North Carolina voters in 2008 and 2012. And we saw good turnout, as I'll talk about a little bit later. But I think one element that I think requires some more research is how many voters may have self-selected out of the process because they thought photo ID was still in place and they didn't have the correct ID. Some research out of Texas indicates that that happened particularly among Latino voters in Texas, another strict ID state. So our rules have been in major flux, and the impact on voters, while the laws were as accessible as they have ever been, largely in 2016 for the general, is still a little bit fuzzy because of all of the flux and because of the photo ID rule in particular. So that is the rules portion. And then in terms of turnout, North Carolina saw pretty much the same turnout level as in 2012. So the raw numbers were pretty much the same. Our ranking nationally was 11th in the nation, the same as in 2012. And it's worth noting that the rules, the same-day registration, the out-of-precinct voting, the early voting, allowed North Carolina to really leap to the top-ish among states in the country. So in 2004, we were 37th in the nation for turnout of eligible registered voters. Thanks to changes in the rules, increasing access, we moved up to 11th in 2012, 2016, and we were even higher in 2008. So overall, the numbers stayed the same, but who voted in North Carolina changed a lot in 2016. Some of that's attributable to the nature of the ticket, right? In 2008 and in 2012, we had very charismatic first African-American president nominated, right? And this exciting coalition around him. A lot of excitement around him. And North Carolina, black voters in North Carolina voted as they had never voted before. Also same-day registration debuted 2008 was the debut federal election cycle for same-day registration. And so in 2016, we had a different charismatic candidate at the top of the ticket. We had Donald Trump driving a lot of enthusiasm among Republican voters, and Republican voters responded to that. So the big performers in 2016 were Republican women, Republican men and Democratic women at 76%, 75%, and 72% turnout rates respectively. So you saw the enthusiasm among North Carolina voters reflected in the groups who turned out to vote. Republicans enthusiastically accessed early voting, and also same-day registration was used at disproportionately high rates by Republican voters. And part of in the core case and in the, I believe, the thinking of lawmakers, the idea behind restricting access to the franchise, getting rid of same-day registration, getting rid of out-of-precinct voting, was to try to reduce access to the vote by black voters in particular, possibly for partisan reasons, but definitely with a racial impact. And what we saw in 2016 is that these voter access tools, like same-day registration and early voting, are in fact, they're this is what Democracy North Carolina knows, they're tools for everybody. They're tools for all voters. When voter access increases, all of our votes rise accordingly. And so in a different election cycle, different kinds of voters will access those tools. And that's a lot of what we saw in 2016. And I hope the message is heard. I hope that the General Assembly hears it, and that we don't see renewed attempts to narrow access to the franchise in 2016. The last thing, and I want to talk about black turnout in 2016. It was down from 2008 and 2012, which were record-setting years, again, with Obama at the top of the ticket. And excellent organizing in North Carolina. But it was not down to pre-Obama levels. And that's important to think about or to recognize. That means that the folks who turned out to vote, who became engaged in the electoral process in 2008 and 2012, even with perhaps a less exciting and less engaging candidate at the top of the ticket, came out. They still remained engaged. They still participated. And it's also important to remember in 2014, when across the nation we saw declines in Black turnout, North Carolina stayed strong, right? We had good turnout. We had Black voters coming out. So I think, this is a dip, but I don't think it spells the end of, by any means, of the record-setting Black participation that we saw in 2008 and 2012. And again, maintaining that access is going to be key to allowing all of us to vote, and especially folks of color and young people. And then the last thing I want to discuss are voter reports. So Democracy North Carolina, in collaboration with our partners, runs big election protection campaigns, and we've run bigger ones since the passage of the Monster Law to try to understand the impact of the law. So in 2016, we operated the election protection hotline, the national hotline of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, during the 17-day early voting period. And I definitely want to give a shout out to Allison Riggs, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, for being an anchor in our election protection work. She was in our office many days and evenings and weekends, answering phone calls from voters. We collaborate with the UNC Center for Civil Rights on Election Day when they run the hotline. And then we had 1,300 monitors in the field on Election Day, 1,000 lay monitors, over 1,000, and about 250 legal monitors. So this was the biggest program we had ever run, and we're still waiting through the data. About 2,000 calls came in through the hotline during the early voting and Election Day period, and we've gotten, as you can imagine, hundreds of reports back from our monitors. But the kinds of problems that we saw identified by voters repeatedly were problems with their registrations from the DMV going through properly, whether they were new registrations or updated registrations. Many voters said they had gone to the DMV, they were not enlisted, they were not in the books. And remember, this is Election Day, so same-day registration was not available. And we heard of that statewide. We also heard about unnecessary hassles with out-of-precinct voting. So in 2014, when we did not have out-of-precinct voting, if someone showed up at an incorrect precinct, they were going to have to go somewhere else. That was sort of a known situation, known potential hassle. We had out-of-precinct voting on Election Day in 2016, and yet voters were pinged around from precinct to precinct, even when they showed up either at their old precinct or their new precinct, where they should have been able to receive assistance and at the new precinct the correct ballot. So we heard about that in, I'll just name a handful of counties: Halifax, Cleveland, Chatham, Wake, Edgecombe, Forsyth, Guilford, Pitt, Sampson. And these are places where, people should have been given, A, they could have gotten a provisional ballot, B, they could have gotten a regular ballot, but instead they were turned away by poll workers. And then we also heard there was also a problem with insufficient curbside voting for people with disabilities, particularly in Mecklenburg, Guilford, Wake, and Durham counties. These are large urban counties where folks are turning out en masse to early vote, and it's not a surprise. And people with disabilities need to be able to access curbside voting. Then bad customer service by poll workers, which often led voters to assume they were being discriminated against. It's a complicated social dynamic when you go vote and you're a person of color and the poll worker you're interacting with is not. And bad customer service is not a good thing for any voter, and then compounds the real racial dynamics of the world that we live in. And so, was it the poll worker's intention? I'm not ready to sort of come down on that, but was it the voter's reality? Yeah. So we heard about those kinds of things again across the state, but particularly in Alamance, Cabarrus, Chatham, Gaston, Onslow, and Wake. And then lastly, just increase reports about voter intimidation. There was a lot of fear, obviously, coming up to the election that there were going to be physical altercations, gun violence at polling places. Fortunately, I didn't hear a lot about that. But we did hear a lot about mobile vehicles, and that's a tough one to pin down. When someone drives in with a loudspeaker, drives in with signs that are racist or intimidating, and then drives out, right? It's hard to pin that down and to stop that from happening. So we saw that during the early voting period. We saw that on Election Day. And that, I'll stop.
All right. Thank you for the invitation to join in this discussion. Isela and I, along with Allison, we have many conversations about this stuff. And for us, it's kind of old hat. For you, it might be new hat. For others, it just might be boring hat. It is the topic of the day for us here. So I welcome this opportunity to share some thoughts and to have some interactions with you. It's always great to see Justice Frye and to hear him. As is his custom, he will generally intersperse some poetry into his comments, poetry that he is able to compose on the spot. So he is just outstanding as that. But I think that he gave us, I think, a good picture good personal picture in 1956 in Ellerby when he went to register to vote and was denied because of the registrar's interpretation of what he should have, of how he should have responded to the questions that were being raised. And I'm very familiar with that, having lived in Jim Crow, North Carolina. My grandfather was born in 1884 in Lenoir County. And that was during the first Reconstruction period. And my grandmother was born in 1896, which was at the tail end of Reconstruction. And I was raised by them and can recall vividly several attempts that they made to register to vote. First of all, they had to drive 14 to 15 miles to the county seat. And when they got there, questions were posed to them, which they did not satisfactorily answer. And it wasn't that they didn't know, it was that their answers did not satisfy the registrar. Or the registrar didn't even know. And I'm reminded of Rosanelle Eaton, who is a plaintiff in our case, who is 94 years old, who went to register to vote when she was 18 years of age in Franklin County. And when she went into the registrar, she was asked to repeat the preamble to the Constitution, which she did perfectly, to the astonishment of those people who were around her, and she was allowed to register.
She was one of few African Americans during that time who were allowed to register to vote. And the discrimination, I mean, well, I guess everybody ought to know the answers to these questions posed by the registrar. But if you were white, you didn't have to answer the questions. They were not posed to you. They were not posed to you as a white because the law did not require that for whites. No matter what level of education they had, they weren't required to demonstrate their ability to answer any questions other than, what's your name? Where do you live? And boy, we're sure glad that you're here. My grandfather and grandmother had an 8th grade education, which was the highest level of education that was available to them at that time. Rosenell Eaton had graduated from high school, because by then you had 12 years of schooling, and she completed high school. Henry Frye completed high school, went to college, and then went to law school. So it wasn't the educational level that had any bearing on whether you could register to vote or not. It was your race. And in North Carolina, as in much of the South, voter registration or voter suppression is based clearly on race. There is no other reason that's been offered that they would suppress the vote. It's been directed toward African Americans. My grandfather, grandmother, didn't know that up until 1835, during slavery, free Africans who owned property could vote in North Carolina. And there was a sizable free African population in North Carolina. In some places, up to 12 to 15% of the population were free Africans, particularly down in the eastern part of the state. I know many of you don't go down there because you have to go through cotton fields and tobacco patches and things like that. And, you know, that's not a very urbane thing to do. But in slavery, you had a large population of free Africans. And the qualifications for voting during slavery for anyone was that they had to be property owners. They had to own real property, not jewelry and stuff like that, but, you know, dirt, I mean, land, and houses and plantations and things of that nature. And that was the qualification for voting. And so prior to 1835, free Africans who owned property could vote. And they were allowed to vote. People directed campaigns toward getting their votes until 1835, when members of the General Assembly who did not depend on these votes from these free Africans decided that, well, we don't want them to vote. And they had a contentious debate in the General Assembly and passed a law which said that if you were a person of color, that you could no longer vote in North Carolina. North Carolina was one of the only states in the South in which that situation existed. Push forward to after the Civil War, and after the Civil War, those many of the people were on the losing side, and a condition for the seceding, those states that had seceded from the Union and formed their own country, the Confederate states of the South, sought to be readmitted into the United States. And as a condition for that readmission, they had to guarantee that newly freed slaves and free blacks, free Africans, would be able to vote. And that then became a part of the new North Carolina Constitution, as African Americans who were now enfranchised, had the ability to vote, then became politically active in the state of North Carolina, led by Abraham Galloway, John Walker Hood, Bishop Hood, and many others. They organized the community, the African American community, or the free African American community, such that they would vote, and vote they did, typically in the range of 90% registration and 90% of voter participation in those days. And they served as delegates to the North Carolina Constitutional Convention. And even before the the U.S. Constitution had enshrined an equal protection clause in the 15th Amendment, anti-discrimination clause, North Carolina had in its Constitution right for all citizens to vote and to enjoy equal protection of the laws, mainly based on the efforts of those African Americans who were a part of the Constitutional Convention. That was one of the things that they pushed for. And then they joined in this populist campaign with disaffected whites, because you have to remember that if whites did not own property, they could not vote prior to 1865. So as African Americans legally gained the right to vote, so did whites who had previously been disenfranchised as well. That right did not extend to women at that time, of either race. But African Americans participated in the franchise and were elected to the North Carolina General Assembly as early as 1870 and all the way up until 1898. And even though there were changes in the political leadership of the state, the African American community stayed politically active and voted in large numbers, which was to the chagrin of the former Confederate officers, former plantation owners, and many whites who did not want African Americans to vote. And a lot of the animosity grew out of a case that you've probably heard something about called Dred Scott, in which Justice Taney said that it was the intent of the framers of the U.S. Constitution that Africans would not, that America was made for white people, by white people, and Africans would never enjoy the status of citizens in this country, and therefore did not have standing to go into court, even to file a claim against, for any reason, in this country. And that's the attitude. Some people call that white supremacy, and it has undergirded North Carolina politics from slavery up until today, and still does. And you can trace the history all the way up. In 1898, there was a violent overthrow, beginning with the Wilmington race riots, where former Confederate soldiers, led by the Democratic Party, in league with or in conspiracy with Josephus Daniels, who was the owner and publisher of the Raleigh News and Observer. And Furniford Simmons, who was the chair person of the North Carolina Democratic Party, and all of their officials engaged in a statewide campaign to purge African Americans from political participation in North Carolina. And on November 10th, 1898, a military brigade of former Confederate soldiers, Klansmen, and red shirts who had been campaigning around the state to drum up support for this anti-African-American campaign with force of arms, overthrew the legitimately elected city government of Wilmington. The only coup d'etat that has occurred in North Carolina, in the United States history, the only coup d'etat that has occurred, and that was the beginning of the end, because in 1898, political participation by African Americans ended, and ushered in then was Jim Crow laws, where everyone had their registrations wiped out and had to re-register. But as they re-registered under the taint or under the hammer of the literacy test that had been enacted by this new Democratic administration. So they had the literacy test, poll taxes, all designed for the purpose of keeping or minimizing the opportunity for African Americans to register and vote. And it wasn't just the law that was important. Joining the law was a physical terrorist campaign led by the Ku Klux Klan and the red shirts and other whites that visited violence upon those African Americans who sought to register to vote, who even thought about registering and voting. And this campaign was it was well known, and people knew that if they dared to go out to challenge, that they were subject to be killed or their homes burned or their jobs taken away. And this was one of the reasons that my grandfather never worked for a white person. He was a carpenter and a bricklayer and operated his own business, which was significant because he was not subject to the economic pressure that could be directed toward him, and he knew how to shoot and was ready to shoot if called upon, if that became necessary. So you have this period from 1898 until 1968, when in the North Carolina General Assembly, no African American was elected. Some ran, but none were elected. In 1947, Reverend Kenneth Williams in Winston-Salem challenged this exclusion and sought to be elected to the city council in Winston-Salem. First time in history that there was a head-to-head contest, political contest, between an African American and a white. And he won because there was this districting process, and African Americans lived in that district and they were able to vote. In response to that, the General Assembly met the next day and created then across the state of North Carolina multi-member political districts, so that you could not go head to head in one district. But it was about race. It was about race. And to bring it up to date, as we looked at and Isela talked about the advances and opportunities that African Americans were able to develop following the Dan Blue administration with cooperation from the new Democratic Party, and created same-day registration, early voting, out-of-precinct voting, and all of those things, which calls for an increase in the registration and participation by African Americans here in North Carolina. And this occurred before Barack Obama became the candidate. And then when the Republicans, the right-wing conservative Republicans, took back control of the state in 2010, the first thing that they did was to go after race, and began, first of all, to create an apartheid political districting in the state, where they isolated African Americans and people of color into a few political districts in order that white Republicans would be guaranteed victory from that point on. And then after Shelby versus Holder, the monster suppression bill, where they, with surgical precision, as the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals described it, went after those specific provisions that African Americans had widely used to increase their voter registration in the state and their participation in this fledgling democracy that we have. So when we talk about voting rights in polarized America, for us, it's about race and race alone. It's not Republicans versus Democrats. Allison will tell you later that when they put together these apartheid districts in the redistricting process, they didn't isolate Democrats into a few political districts. They only isolated African Americans who just happened to be Democrats in those districts. So it's all about race. And until we resolve the racial issue and this notion of white supremacy that goes all the way back to slavery and is embodied in the Dred Scott decision, then there will always be polarized politics in North Carolina.
Thanks, Irving. Just a couple comments, and I want to open it up for questions. I think it's really critical, this history lesson that you just got is absolutely essential to understanding the issues that we're trying to address around voting rights in North Carolina. I mean, it's not that, something new has emerged. This is a couple century long struggle over the franchise. And it's really important to understand the dynamics of that as we look back in time, and to appreciate both the similarities and the differences of the post-Civil War period, the late 19th century, the era of the 1960s, or the present. But there's a lot of continuity in the structure of that struggle, of the issues that it's about. And I guess one question I want to just maybe throw open to the audience to think about is the question is, why is it important for some people to restrict the right of other people to participate in the political system? Why is it that African Americans in particular have been, and not entirely, but in particular have been singled out repeatedly for kind of being marginalized in this whole political process. I mean, is there something other than just kind of blatant prejudice at work here? Are there other social and economic and political factors that we need to understand that are part of that, so that we understand the larger context of voter suppression and restrictions on the electorate? So I'm interested in whether people have thoughts on that, or thoughts, questions, and responses to the discussion we just had. Yes.
This is a question for Ms. Gutierrez. What is the status of the voter restriction laws that were implemented and then discarded? Is there still outstanding litigation or appeals going on?
Yeah, and I think that will be discussed later in the day. But yeah, the Fourth Circuit ruled and enjoined the law, and then on his way out the door, Governor McCrory filed a cert petition with the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's pending, and Democracy North Carolina has asked Governor Cooper and Attorney General Stein to pull the cert petition from the U.S. Supreme Court. They have not done so yet, but we've got a petition that we actually wait for you all to send an email directly to them and encourage folks to contact them. We do think it's something that that they should do. And while I am speaking, I'll just say that I'm sorry, I misunderstood the structure of the panel. I do have something to say about voter fraud, because I think that the allegations that we saw in December following Governor McCrory's loss were very concerning. And we're seeing this whole voter fraud drama play out also on the federal stage, where there are these, and we saw it in 2013. The justification for the passage of the Monster Law was this claim that there was voter fraud, and that the only reason we couldn't see the rampant voter fraud was because we weren't looking hard enough. We weren't looking in the right ways. And so there was this invisible enemy, this invisible threat that had to be stopped. And thus we get the monster voter law. Of people who study voter fraud know that in-person voter fraud, the kind that is prohibited by the existence of a photo ID law, is very rare. It's much more common to see a fraud committed via absentee ballot. And again, I want to say clearly, there is not a rampant voter fraud in the country, and this is not an epidemic, and this is not a danger to the integrity of our democracy. What is a danger are these oppressive laws and restricting access and the continued oppression and suppression of African Americans and other people of color, and this continued effort to push them out of political power. So and in the Monster Law, there was not restriction of absentee voting, which is disproportionately used, has been by Republicans, white Republicans. There was, in fact, an opportunity. There were openings. There were things that made it more accessible for folks than it had previously been under the existing election law. So despite the specter of voter fraud that is used to justify the passage of the Monster Law in 2013, we don't see any evidence of it. Then Governor McCrory loses. At that point, the loss was still small enough for a recount. He could have just asked for a recount. He had that ability, and that could have just been it. But instead, we saw these allegations of voter fraud and these claims that people with felony convictions were voting, people who were dead, dead people were voting. Calling up the Chicago political machine, sort of the history that we all know at least a little bit about, and that people were voting, they were double voting. People were voting in multiple states, and that there were absentee voter fraud mills going on, that black political organizations were falsifying absentee ballots and influencing elections in that way in multiple counties across the state. And then claims that just the entire process was bankrupt, that election administrators were inaccurately entering data in ways that would allow Governor Cooper to win, despite the fact that Trump won the state and there were other Republican victories up and down the ticket. So, And there was, and even when these claims were debunked, even when Democracy North Carolina, for example, did research on the 43 people who at that time had been accused of voting with an active felony conviction and found that half of them did not have a felony conviction. They did not, they had maybe a misdemeanor conviction. They had no conviction at all because they were not the person who was being accused, who had a felony conviction. It was a case of mistaken identity. Even when we found that those allegations were false, there was no apology from the McCrory campaign. There was no apology from the NCGOP. There was a doubling down on, yes, there is fraud. Yes, there is a problem. We need to be suspicious of our election system, of our elections administrators. And so, and then we see, well, SCSJ has filed a defamation lawsuit on behalf of 4 voters in Guilford County who were falsely accused of voter fraud. Professor Joyner beautifully defended the Bladen County Improvement Association before the State Board of Elections, pointing out that there was 0 evidence of fraud, and that the other 7 counties where allegations of fraud, absentee voter mills had happened, there was even less evidence. So negative evidence in these other counties where there are these allegations of absentee voter mills. And now we have at the at the head of our nation, Trump and his associates saying, no, there is voter fraud. 3 to 5 million illegal or undocumented immigrants, unclear depending on the day, voting, and a refusal to back down, and equating having some mistakes on the voter rolls, right? We've got these big government data sets. They're never going to be 100% clean. And so sometimes you're going to have people who they just moved to North Carolina. Their names are still on the voter rolls. Is that voter fraud? The dead people who are alleged to have voted, they cast their own ballots and then they died. That's perfectly legal. It's something that, all of us here probably hope to vote one last time before we ever have to pass on. And so it is what we expect to see, what we believe the logic behind the voter fraud claims was, because the numbers were never enough to allow Governor McCrory a victory. We think it was all to lay a pretext for further voter suppression laws in this upcoming session. And it's terrifying to think what the absolutely factless rhetoric at the federal level is presaging. What kind of reforms that is those allegations are heralding. So I'm sorry to say that I think the historical period we're in now is one of suppression like we haven't seen since, and pushback like we haven't seen since the 60s. And I don't think that in many ways there are questions about whether our democracy will look the same in the next few years. I have a 1-year-old. I think about this a lot. But I certainly think that we'll be looking very soon at voting laws and registration rules that look much more like the 70s and 80s than they do like the 21st century.
Let me just add a couple of points. Okay. One is that, Isela talked about the claim of fraud, specific allegations made around the state. Every county election board in North Carolina is controlled by the Republican Party. And those Republican-controlled boards of the election did not find, after all of the claims that were presented to them, that there was any fraud. So it wasn't like there was this onslaught of Democrats making these determinations. The irony of all of that is that at the beginning of this process, McCrory was trailing by about 5,000 votes. And then as they recounted votes in county after county, the gap grew. And finally it grew past the point that McCrory could call for a recount, because you had to be under 10,000 votes. And by the time they finished calculating the recount, it exceeded 10,000 votes, and he he pimped himself out of contention to be able to claim. Now, there have been some discoveries of fraud in North Carolina and a couple of prosecutions for that. And in those cases, those persons were Republicans who were charged with and convicted of voter fraud. And then with respect to registration in different states, it was revealed that Trump's daughter was registered in a couple of places. Steve Bannon was registered in 3 different states, and other members of the Trump administration were registered in a number of different states, which is not illegal. It is only where you're able to establish that they voted in different states, and there was no evidence that anyone ever voted in more than one state. So all of this is, well, in the street we call it the okie doke. And the okie doke that Trump is pushing and has been coined here in North Carolina, because this claim of voter fraud started full-time here in North Carolina by this Republican, this conservative Republican control, and they are still beating that dead horse, and that dead horse will stay dead.
Question back here.
I'm from California, and I've followed some of these issues from afar that you've been talking about. But what is the breakdown as far as voting registration for Democrats and Republicans between African Americans and whites? Do you have that information, or just a general sense of that?
I have a general sense. I don't have the actual numbers. African American voters in North Carolina are largely Democratic or unaffiliated, but they're largely Democratic. There are more registered Democratic voters than, and that's the largest party of record. Unaffiliated voters are growing significantly. There are fewer people who are registered as Republicans. So in terms of like the roles, Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliateds, with unaffiliateds really pushing. But black voters are predominantly Democratic.
And then
voters.
with whites, I assume that they're predominantly Republican. Is that true?
No, they're maybe I'm not sure of the exact numbers.
Well, just kind of
About half, or
you know, that possibly an easy fix for the, as you've been mentioning, the conservative Republican administrations is just to target the black districts, and they get kind of a 2-for-1. If they oppress African American voters, and they also get oppress Democrats at the same time. So it's just an easy way for them to accomplish those goals.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yeah.
I think that part of what the litigation has turned on this. What I understand is that the lawmakers have said that they were not trying to go after voters for because they were black, but because they were Democrats. They were seeking partisan advantage, not racialized voter suppression. And as Irv said, the Fourth Circuit found in its examination of the monster law that argument didn't hold water. So I think what you're suggesting seems to be the case.
Back here, and then I think this gentleman here. Yeah.
I guess going directly off of that, I mean, given how closely intertwined race and partisanship are these days, especially as we get more and more polarized, how do you go about examining if a new law comes in that's suppressing voting ability, voting rights, determining whether or not partisanship or race is the animus behind that bill?
That's a question for our litigators, and what the record looks like. But I think also my take is that it's tough to separate. So if the question centers on am I a hyperpartisan or am I a racist, then we probably need a little bit more examination of what your motivation is. The second thing I'd say is, of course, what is the impact? This is, I think, an argument that I've heard, or something I've heard Reverend Barber say, that the Jim Crow laws were racially neutral. They didn't say black people cannot X, or people of color cannot X. And so in order for a law to be enforced in a way that discriminates against people of color, it doesn't have to say in there, this law is especially for black folks. Irv?
Well, it has to show that it has an impact, that the impact is directed toward that community. The literacy test was pretty clear. The literacy test was neutral on its face until you got to the exception part, which allowed similarly situated whites to register to vote without having to go through a literacy test, although the literacy test never said that it was directed at African Americans, but when you read the rest of the law, it was clear that that was the direction. And then the kind of wide discretion that was given to individual registrars to make the determination of whether you satisfied the literacy test that they imposed. There was no standard that existed. So then you look at the numbers. You look at the numbers. You look at the statistics. Who came in to register, who was allowed to register, who was not allowed to register, and from that you can extrapolate to make that determination. Then you look at what the people are saying, and we have been able to find what they call smoking gun statements all over the place that would emblaze on the whole process this notion of racial animus. I mentioned before that Democrats were not siphoned off to be placed in apartheid-like districts. Only African Americans who just happened to be Democrats. So the claim that it was done to minimize the Democrats would fail, where there is overwhelming evidence that this was directed toward African Americans, even African Americans who are Republicans, because there's always been a strong history in North Carolina of African Americans being Republicans in the state, particularly here in Durham, where there is a large number of African Americans who are Republicans, yes. One other point I wanted to make in terms of felons, because people are really upset about that. In North Carolina, convicted felons can vote by law. The law allows convicted felons to vote as long as they have completed their sentence, taken care of all of their probationary issues, then they can legally vote in North Carolina, and all they have to do is go down to the Board of Elections and register, and then they can vote. So the notion that there were convicted felons who voted, obviously that was true, because the law allowed them to do that, and people campaigned for these convicted felons to vote for, but people were alarmed that somehow this convicted felon would dare be able to vote for somebody as if they had leprosy or something. But the law allows that to occur in the state.
One in the back.
You mentioned that voter suppression laws could return to how they were in the 70s and 80s. I just want to push back against that a little bit from the perspective of a Georgia voter. So I don't know much about North Carolina, but there are certain things now that there used to not be, like absentee voting without excuse or much more early voting. So do you think these are the type of things that might go away?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. And so I would say not even voter suppression laws. I'm talking about voting laws, because voter suppression is you're suppressing the vote. I'm talking about our election laws and our election structure. So, and I'm also including federal laws like the National Voter Registration Act. So I do think, yes, my concern is that we would see a change in a lot of what we have come to assume are just the way that we vote. For example, I'm guessing that you did not report in person to your board. You might have filled out a form and sent it in via mail or registered via a registration drive. Prior to the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, you would not have had that option in North Carolina, and I don't know what the rules are in Georgia. So it's sort of these kinds of things are the kinds of things that I fear as a voting rights advocate. That the stage may be set for that kind of pushback. That is not just the VRA, which of course I fear for, and not just the kind of the ongoing attacks against black voters, but that in general voter access will be restricted.
One of the things that undergirds this suppression effort, or the politically, is this notion of states' rights, that the states have the authority and the right to decide what voting rules will apply in that particular state. And that is a mainstay of the Republican agenda, is that, states should decide that the Voting Rights Act, for instance, is overreaching because their Congress imposed itself and took away power from the states. The NVRA is an overreach by Congress because that took power away from the states to determine how they were going to control their elections. For African Americans, the 1965 Voting Rights Act was an essential enactment in terms of guaranteeing and protecting the right to vote. And I want to just end, right now we have a situation where Congress is controlled by Tea Party and right-wing Republicans. The Senate is controlled by Tea Party and white-wing Republicans. The presidency is controlled by something. It's not really known what the political philosophy is, and that in a few months, the Supreme Court will be controlled by conservative justices, thereby creating a situation where, one, the Supreme Court can declare that the 1965 Voting Rights Act was overreaching and is unconstitutional in the same way that they undermined the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby decision, or Congress can act to repeal the Voting Rights Act completely, and that will be signed by the president, whoever will be president at that time. So for us, this is a real dangerous period of time because 50% of the vote can take away all of the voting protection that African Americans and other racial minorities have in this country.
Yes, sir, right in the center.
Yeah. Good morning. I've enjoyed this. Just to push a little further, and this actually segues into what Professor Joyner was talking about. This, part of that states' rights notion is the sort of argument setting at least race from the surface for a moment and sort of saying election integrity, right? We just want common sense reform that ensures that elections work well. And that rhetoric, to me, seems interrelated with the voter fraud conversations, but at the same time, sort of the separate, kind of almost the respectable version of it, as opposed to this sort of fire-breathing voter fraud hyperbolic claims. I mean, what's the panel's view of that rhetoric? It's sort of, we're just making sure elections work well, which is why we need voter ID and limiting access rules and these other voter regulation changes.
I think that the rhetoric is that in North Carolina, those rhetorical sides are aligning more and more. So I think initially there was this, we need ID. Why not have ID? And of course, ID, I think, among American voters, there's not, or the Americans, especially post 9/11, we need ID for so many things, right? And I think that voter ID is not the most, people don't immediately think this is terrible. It's conceivable for, I think, many Americans that it could be just a voter integrity claim. But as we dig deeper into some of the voter integrity questions, like claiming that let's see, same-day registration is fraud, or double registrations are fraud, or if the lists are dirty, it's fraud, or if someone dies and their name isn't immediately removed from the rolls the second that they pass, it's fraud. Then I think then it becomes less and less clear. I mean, the line between, common sense election integrity reform and the fire-breathing fraud claims become less and less clear. And I would say that in North Carolina, I've seen the arguments and the claims of the there's an organization called the Voter Integrity Project in North Carolina, so I'm having a little trouble separating out. And they are a fire-breathing fraud seeing machine. So I am having a little bit of trouble with the word integrity. but I think that among the more moderate, kind of respectable, we just need to have good elections, that we are seeing more and more of the far-right rhetoric just bleeding into that. And I would really love, and then, a real challenge we're talking about this in terms of Republicans and Democrats, but we're in Bronx, North Carolina, as a nonpartisan group, and voter suppression and gerrymandering have been used by both political parties. And so a real challenge for me as an advocate is that I am unable to have a conversation with North Carolina lawmakers about voter access and convenience in a way that is not completely loaded and down with this voter fraud fear and the hyper-partisan atmosphere.
A lot of this notion of voter integrity is based on what people think. It has nothing to do with the numbers. Prior to 2008, this notion of voter integrity was not a big cry. There were probably 13 or 14 people talking about it at that time. But lo and behold, this guy, Barack Hussein Obama, had the gall to go out here and run to be president. And white people, his white side, white people voted for him. And people were aghast. Said, how the hell did that happen? And then he went on to beat Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary. And people were incredulous. Oh my God. How did that happen? And then he went on to win the 2008 election. And at that point, it became the drum roll. Oh, there must be something wrong. There's got to be something wrong. There's got to be something wrong. All of these people didn't just come out of nowhere and vote for this African American. So there's something, and we cannot stand the fact that now we have in this country an African American who is the president. And then that was repeated in 2012. And as with each succeeding year, this drum roll of voter integrity increased. It increased. And now it is all consuming because now Trump, that's his main message. And that's why 3 to 5 million people, the gap between his vote and Hillary Clinton, why they voted, 3 million people voted for him illegally because that was fraud. But it's the drum roll. And if you repeat it often enough, some people are going to believe it. And what we have now in this country is this belief that this has happened because the impossible occurred in 28 and 2012 to produce the election of the first African American, and that has outraged people. And there is now a sense that we need to do everything in our power to ensure that that never happens again. In 1835, when they prohibited African Americans from voting here in North Carolina, the justification was if we let them do this, there's going to be Negro domination. And in 1898, when they had the Wilmington race riot and overthrow here in North Carolina, the cry that went out across the state was that we need to avoid Negro domination. And when Kenneth Williams was elected in Winston-Salem as city councilman there, they changed the election procedure because we can't stand to have this Negro domination. That is one thing that we cannot have. And then when the Voting Rights Act was passed, people were concerned again about Negro domination. And if you listen to what the leadership of the Republican Party is saying now in 2010 and 2013 with this redistricting and this voter suppression law, is that we need to be wary of Negro domination. And to some people, having an African American in a position, in an elected position, is a clear sign that that's Negro domination.
Yeah.
ID, which you brought up. I used to not think it would lead to any voter suppression. I've recently seen, I think the New York Times wrote a pretty recent article about how there's like some statistical proof that it does lead to fewer black voters. In light of the fact that people wrongly think so much fraud's happening, is there any sense though that the advantage of a voter ID law would restore integrity into the system and lead to this less divisive rhetoric? And if not that, do you think a voter ID law with subsidized identification for everyone would quell any fear that there would be voter suppression?
So it hasn't in North Carolina, I'd say, is the answer to both of your questions. So, you know, we had a voter ID law in place, so we didn't see any backing down from the voter fraud claims. And I have a hard time. I mean, you know, and all of this is sort of, it's so specific. Many laws in the many states in the country have some form of voter ID law. What North Carolina and Texas had was a very strict voter ID law, right? So it wasn't just that provide some form of ID and here are these multiple options and here are some other ways for you to deal with it if you don't have an ID. It was, these are the 4 or 5 IDs you must have, and if you don't have them, you cannot vote. And part of the law, a way to try to make it constitutional was that you would be able to access a free ID from the DMV, that you could get a free birth certificate or a free marriage certificate, which is one of the forms of identification, underlying forms that you need to get your ID from the DMV. And that was not well implemented in North Carolina. It didn't work. It worked so badly, in fact. I mean, and again, it's all so complicated because there are counties in North Carolina that are rural and heavily black where the DMV is not even open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. There are limited DMV hours. There are limited DMV branches. If you have limited transportation, it's tough for you to get there. If you work, especially a job that doesn't allow you to take time off, then it's hard for you to get there. So in terms of, and then the DMV failed to give people IDs. When people would come in and ask for their free IDs, DMV staff would say, no, you can't have a free ID. And at Democracy North Carolina, we were telling people, make sure you say, I want a free ID to vote. as a way of trying to get over that. And yet the implementation was still so poor that the General Assembly softened the voter ID law to add this reasonable impediment declaration as sort of a safety net to try to make the ID law not as strict. That the Fourth Circuit still, that was not well implemented either, and the Fourth Circuit still found the law to be illegally discriminatory. But I hear what you're saying, that maybe if we give a little bit in a few of these ways and we make some adjustments, then all of this polarization will die down and things will get better for elections generally. And I have not seen that here. I have seen a ramping up of the rhetoric, a ramping up of the frenzy and the hysteria, and because what Irv is saying is right. It is driven by racism and by a desire to exclude voters who are scary. And it's mostly black folks. It's also Latinos. It's also Asian Americans. It's also young voters. Who else use same-day registration disproportionately? Young people. Because what same-day registration is it's a boon for people who move a lot. And I'm guessing that most of you in here are not homeowners. And even if you were, you're not sure that North Carolina or Durham is your home for the rest of your life. So then you're going to move, and your registration is going to change. And so I wish that I felt like lawmakers and policymakers were in a place where they were negotiating from good faith and where the actual impetus was common sense reforms of the system to make things better. Then we could have a conversation. Then we wouldn't be at a symposium about voting rights in polarized America. But that has not been my experience.
One of the simple ways to deal with this identification issue is for the state of North Carolina, with all of the money that it has, simply go take a picture of everybody who's registered to vote and put it on the computer screen. Kind of like when you go to your bank, for those of you, I know y'all have bank. When you go to the bank to withdraw money or to cash a check, you give them whatever your withdrawal slip or your check. They can pull up your picture on the computer very easily. They can just pull it up on the computer. I know I have a credit card that has my picture on it. You could have voter registration cards with everybody's picture on it. So when they show up to vote, they can merely show their registration card that would have their picture. There are a lot of ways to deal with this identification question, but the legislature in this instance specifically looked for those things that African Americans and Latinos and racial minorities were less likely to have, and they excluded they included those things as the requirement and excluded other common sense forms of ID that could have been presented. Final line is that the North Carolina Constitution imposes two conditions to be able to vote. One is that you're a citizen. Two, that you're 18 years of age and you reside in the state, citizen who resides in the state, and that you're 18 years of age. Those are constitutionally the only requirements to vote. Everything else is procedure, process but the constitutional requirements are very clear. And it is the state's obligation to develop mechanisms to ensure that those people who meet the constitutional qualifications are allowed to vote.
And I guess the other thing I just like to say about the common sense reform, we're just trying to improve the system kind of claim and trying to give credence to it, right? Because I'm hearing a few questions about what if that is really the legitimate reason for pursuing these laws? And I want to say that if then I would like to see money, increase modernization, increase, right now, not every polling place in North Carolina has access to the internet, for example. People are working off paper lists, okay, of who is in this precinct. We've got DMV offices that aren't even open for 5 days a week, right? There's a problem with access to funding, access to resources by local elections boards and for voters at the county level. And so if there is, and right now, all elections are funded locally. County elections are funded locally. The state of North Carolina does not give money to counties to run elections. And so you have a different election experience in every county in the state. And if you're an African American who lives in Eastern North Carolina or any other rural county, or if you're a white voter who lives there, you're having a very different experience from other people. Your county has less money, fewer resources. So if the interest were really to improve our election system, then let's put some money into it. Let's put some money into modernizing our system and making things better, making things easier. We haven't seen that at all. So anyone who has a desire or the ear of the General Assembly should definitely go tell them that.
Question?
It was largely answered. I was going to ask, kind of off of a couple of your points you talked about in the beginning, where most of the same-day registration, especially this last time, was used by Republicans. And yet you also talked about how you can't have a conversation that's not politically charged. And since this is kind of about polarized voting, how do you see any way of kind of combining those two, of explaining to the Republicans in particular that this is for them as well?
We're going to give it a try. and I want to clarify that it's, in terms of the numbers, I think Democrats use it a little bit more, but just because there are more democratically affiliated voters. But Republicans used it disproportionately to their registration numbers. But yeah, we're going to give it a try. We're going to try to say, look, these are tools for everybody. Voter access is for everybody. There are many more white voters than any other kind of voter in the state. And so those are the majority of voters, those are the people who are going to be using it. Right now, Democracy North Carolina is not viewed as a neutral purveyor of information by the leadership of the state. So again, if there are other people here who, it's a message that we should all be carrying, because it's such a polarized environment that my facts are alternative facts to people in leadership.
Do you have a... Yeah, do you have a hand up? Yes. Okay.
I came today because I had several issues personally that I wanted to share, and as I've listened, they've all come into play, so give me just a second. I moved to Durham from Florida in September. I was at Durham Days or some downtown event, and somebody came up and asked me if I wanted to register to vote, and I filled out a form on a clipboard. It was the easiest thing I think I've ever done. When I showed up to vote in November, I said my name. They said, oh yeah, here you are. It was the easiest voting I've ever done. So I was kind of proud of that. But that said, I now have nightmares that Stephen Miller is going to show up at my front door because I assume I'm still registered in Florida. And even though it's not illegal to be registered in two places, how do I know it won't be in 3 weeks? By some executive order. That's a problem I have. The second thing I want to say is about the idea, Professor, about the voter ID cards with the picture. That's a great idea because any other kind of ID is so manipulated. In Florida, they made it under the auspices of protecting us all after September 11th that in order to get even your driver's license renewed, even if you had been in the state for 30 years, you had to bring in like 10 forms of ID. That was ridiculous. I had to get my birth certificate from Alabama and all these other things together. And I think that really was just a way of making it harder for people to vote. I really believe that was the emphasis behind that. And the third thing is, in 2000, I showed up to vote and was told I couldn't vote. This was again in Florida. Told I couldn't vote because I was a convicted felon.
Wow.
I said, I am not a convicted felon. I've never been a convicted felon. And I was told, well, you have to prove that. There was, there's no way to prove a negative. And so all of these things that conspire, I'm white. I've been the victim of these kinds of things. So I fully understand the frustration that African Americans have felt, not fully, but as close as probably possible, have felt about these issues. And there's no question in my mind that the results of the 2016 election were 100% racial. I've tried to say that it's an anti-intellectual movement, but it still, goes through the funnel and comes out racism. So I definitely think these are issues that it's easy to say, yeah, what's so hard about having an ID? It's just a much bigger picture that people really need to understand.
Yep. Time for a couple more questions here, and then David will get to you. And then we probably need to take a little break before our next panel. So.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thank you so much. I think this is a really important conversation to have. And then I wanted to just bring up an issue that, Isela, you had mentioned about big data and about, we've talked about how the conversation has shifted about voter fraud and concerns about that since 2008, 2012. And I think one of the drivers of that is the access of big data, whether it's data about felons or data about non-citizens or data about people who may or may not have been mail verified. And the access to that data has changed so much now. I'd be interested to hear your opinion, or your opinion, Professor, about, what the role is of that.
Yeah, I am a strong civil libertarian, so I certainly don't want to restrict public access to public data. And there's been a democratization of access to this data, and North Carolina has some of the most open voter rolls of any state, which means that folks who have experience, whether because they were programmers in the 80s or 90s, right, people who have experience and expertise with databases are able to pull the voter rolls and match them, as Caitlin is saying, against DMV data, jury excusal data, felon databases, et cetera. And I think that the big challenge is, of course, those databases are not clean. I mean, there are mistakes. I really want to know what your name is, but I'm not going to ask you in front of everybody. The gentleman who just spoke, just because I'm imagining that your name is somewhat common, right? There's some reason. We know that in 2000, when the felon voter purge happened, that the match rate that the state of Florida agreed to, I think, was 80%. A match, positive match between first name, last name, and date of birth. It's a very low data match level. They knew, the state of Florida understood, because they were warned by the data company, that they would be netting a lot of false positives, and yet they went ahead with it, okay? And so we have to be I think that we're in this time, and maybe we've been here for a while, like the computer era, where numbers are true, words could be lies, quantitative data is real, your personal story is BS, okay? And it's really, and it's deeply problematic, because numbers can lie just as well as words. And what we see with the data matching is a desire to make the numbers say what you want them to say. So poor research, which is what we saw with the with the McCrory campaign's election protests, combined with lots of access to data, and then a desire, an ideological desire to see what you want, is leading to a really dangerous time, I think, for our democracy. And I don't know, I don't want to restrict data access, but we do think there should be some additional higher levels of scrutiny required, more hoops for people to go through before they're able to just say, I ran 2 databases together at home late at night, and I have decided that there are 10,000 felons, and 7,000 of them are illegal, are undocumented, you know, and 3,000 of them are registered in 5 states. That it's deeply damaging to our democracy. It's damaging to questions of integrity. It means that election administrators are constantly being called. The whether or not our elections are fairly administered is constantly being questioned, and it's really being deeply undermined. So I don't have the answer, but I'm very concerned about it as well.
David, one last question.
Ms. Gutierrez, you mentioned before this specter of voter fraud, even though there isn't the evidence to support it. At the same time, we hear stories, very charged stories of both Republicans and Democrats who are voting illegally. A handful of stories, but they receive probably a disproportionate amount of attention, and they carry a narrative with them. So I was wondering if you could speak more about how we prove the negative and how we know, and kind of how we make the argument so that there isn't necessarily wiggle room to say, well, we just, we can't say definitively, we don't know for sure, and therefore it could still be happening.
I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I mean, I guess what I would say is an extraordinary amount of resources have gone into trying to identify potential fraud. I mean, we've seen, like in the George W. Bush presidency, many resources were dedicated to trying to find fraud. And lots of effort. U.S. attorneys were fired. Their integrity was questioned. They were pushed because they were being pushed to bring politically charged cases that didn't have lots of good evidence. We heard about the Marion 3 in 1985, during Sessions' nomination confirmation hearings. We've heard about, his track record as an attorney. And so we know that voter fraud has been around for a while as this specter, this way of undermining access to the vote. And so the resources expended to try to find these limited examples, and only being able to find a handful, I think that says something. We also know in Kansas, Chris Kobach, Secretary of State, pushed to have more investigative authority and more law enforcement authority because he wanted to investigate and get down to the bottom of all these voter fraud cases. He didn't find many. And those he did find crumbled before he could actually bring them to trial. So he had to settle them. I think that says something. And I'll say that for those of you who are researchers who have research interest, I mean, the question of how to prove the negative is also a challenge in terms of trying to determine the effect of voter suppression, of laws that decrease access and that are racially targeted. And so our report in 2014 about silenced voters, we were looking at historical data about who used these tools in the past and what the demographics were, what the numbers were, and then we were also looking at stories, so trying to combine a qualitative and a quantitative approach. We weren't sure. I mean, we were weaving a way of analyzing this as we were making the path by walking it, and then in the March primary, though, in 2016, the numbers were similar numbers of people voted in the March 2016 primary as did in the 2014 general. We had SDR and OOP, and approximately 30,000 people used same-day registry, were enfranchised by the use of those rules, which was the number that we came up with based on our analysis in 2014 of trying to prove the negative. It made us feel pretty good about the analysis we had developed. So I guess what I'd say is I think it's a question for all of us in the room to try to figure out, how do you prove that? Or it's a classic gaslighting debate, I guess, too. It's like if someone keeps saying, there's fraud, you just can't find it. And you say, but there's no evidence of it. You can't even find real evidence of it when you look really hard. I mean, we've got to come up with some other research strategies for trying to prove the negative. And maybe those of you who are litigators in the room may already know about some cutting-edge strategies being employed by data scientists. So maybe that's something that will come up later on today, too.
It's easy to make the claim. It's easy to claim that dead people are voting. But until there's a picture of a bus coming from the cemetery, with people in it, then
Zombies?
there's no evidence. There's no evidence. And we live in an evidence-based society. Where is the proof? And if Stevie Wonder can't see it, it doesn't exist. Because all of these things are provable if they exist. And until you're able to put it on the table, it's no more than I had a dream.
Nice.
Okay, and with that, let's thank our panelists who've been really